Mateo's hollow cheeks burned with shame as the sheriff raised the whip, his crime of stealing corn to feed his dying siblings about to be paid in blood. No one expected the stoic Apache trader to approach the platform, silver coins in hand to purchase 3 white children from a town that had left them to starve. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The relentless Arizona sun beat down upon the cracked earth like a hammer striking an anvil. Summer of 1877. 3 months without rain had turned the territory into a graveyard of withered crops and parched hopes. In a small, dilapidated shack at the edge of Whitewater Creek, 12-year-old Mateo Miller sat motionless, watching the shallow breathing of his twin siblings. At 3 years old, Emma and Elijah were unnaturally quiet, their once plump cheeks now hollow, their eyes too large in their gaunt faces. Mateo's stomach twisted with familiar pain, but he ignored it. Hunger had become his constant companion since the fever took their parents 6 weeks earlier. First mother, then father, both gone within days of each other. No relatives, no neighbors close enough to notice, just Mateo and the twins trying to survive on whatever he could scavenge. "Teo," Emma whispered, her voice dry as the creek bed outside. "Hungry." Mateo stroked her matted hair. "I know, Em. I'll find something soon, I promise." He reached for the water jug, pouring the last few drops into a tin cup. The twins took turns sipping, their cracked lips barely touching the metal. Mateo didn't drink. He hadn't had water since yesterday, saving every precious drop for Emma and Elijah. "Tell us about the mountains again," Elijah murmured, curling closer to his sister on their shared pallet. Mateo swallowed hard, his throat rough as sandpaper. "There are mountains to the north with trees so tall they touch the clouds, and rivers that never run dry, even in the hottest summers. The water is so clear you can see rainbow-colored fish swimming beneath the surface." "Will we go there?" Emma's eyes fluttered closed. "Someday," Mateo promised, though he knew they wouldn't survive another week without food. He'd already sold everything of value their parents had owned: mother's silver hairbrush, father's pocket watch, the single book of poetry they'd read by candlelight. The last of the cornmeal had been consumed 3 days ago. Yesterday, he'd found a bird's nest with 2 small eggs, but they'd barely been enough for the twins to share. Rising on unsteady legs, Mateo stepped outside. The setting sun painted the desert in shades of blood and fire. In the distance, he could see the Henderson farm with its acres of corn, tall and green despite the drought. Mr. Henderson had access to the deepest well in the county, drilled by workers brought in from the east. His crops thrived while others withered. Mateo had asked for work twice. The first time, Mr. Henderson had laughed at the boy's skinny arms. The second time, he'd set his dogs loose, warning Mateo not to trespass again. His gaze drifted back to the shack where the twins slept. They wouldn't last much longer without food. Neither would he, though that mattered less to Mateo. He'd promised Mother as she lay dying that he would protect Emma and Elijah. So far, he'd failed. The idea came to him as the first stars appeared overhead. It was wrong. Father had been strict about honesty, about respecting others' property, but Father wasn't here, and the twins were starving. Just a few ears of corn, enough to keep them alive another day or two, enough time to figure out something else. Mateo watched the lights go out in the Henderson farmhouse. He would wait until dawn, when the night was darkest, just before the sun rose. He would be quick, silent, in and out before anyone noticed. As he returned to the shack, Mateo's heart pounded with fear and resolve. Tomorrow he would become a thief, but tonight he would tell the twins another story about mountains they would never see. The darkest hour before dawn found Mateo crouched at the edge of Henderson's cornfield. His threadbare shirt hung from his bony shoulders and his heart hammered against his ribs. The corn stood tall before him, row after row of life-giving sustenance. From his hiding place, he could see the farmhouse, dark and silent. He hesitated, his father's voice echoing in his memory. "A miller always earns his way, son. Honest work for honest pay." But the memory of Emma's hollow cheeks and Elijah's listless eyes pushed him forward. Mateo slipped between the rows like a shadow, moving quickly despite his weakness. The corn towered above him, leaves rustling softly as he passed. He selected ears carefully, testing each one with a gentle squeeze before twisting it free. 6, 7, 8 ears, each one a treasure, each one a sin. He worked methodically, stuffing the corn into the small sack he'd brought. Just a few more, and he could return to the twins. Perhaps boil some right away, mash it soft for their shrunken stomachs. The dog's bark shattered the silence like a gunshot. Mateo froze, the 9th ear of corn still attached to its stalk. He heard men's voices, then the beam of a lantern cut through the darkness. He abandoned the ear and turned to run, clutching the sack to his chest. "There he is!" a gruff voice shouted. Mateo's legs, weakened by weeks of hunger, betrayed him. He stumbled, falling hard onto the packed earth. The precious corn spilled from his sack. As he scrambled to gather it, rough hands seized him by the arms. "Got him, Mr. Henderson!" The farmhand's grip tightened painfully. "Caught him red-handed, just like you said." A second man appeared, holding a lantern high. In its glow, Mateo recognized Jacob Henderson's weathered face, now twisted with anger. "The miller boy," Henderson spat. "I warned you about trespassing. Now you're stealing my corn?" "Please," Mateo whispered, his voice breaking. "My brother and sister, they're starving." Henderson's eyes narrowed. "Not my concern. Thieving is thieving." Dawn was breaking as they dragged Mateo back to the farmhouse. His feet barely touched the ground between the two men. The corn lay forgotten in the dirt. "Get the twins," Henderson ordered a third man who had appeared on the porch. "We'll take the whole lot to town. Make an example of them." Terror seized Mateo's heart. "No, please, leave them be. They're just babies." His pleas fell on deaf ears. An hour later, he found himself standing in Whitewater's town square, his wrists bound with rough rope. Emma and Elijah clung to his legs, confused and frightened by the crowd gathering around them. Someone had retrieved the stolen corn, which lay in a pile before them, evidence of his crime. Mayor Franklin, a corpulent man with a permanent sheen of sweat on his forehead, addressed the growing assembly. "Folks, we've got ourselves a thief," he announced, pointing at Mateo. "Caught stealing from Henderson's farm." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mateo recognized many faces, people who had attended his parents' funeral, who had expressed sympathy, offered prayers, but no practical help. "Please," he tried again, voice hoarse. "I was just trying to feed my brother and sister." "Silence!" the mayor bellowed. "Stealing is a serious offense on the frontier. We can't have people taking what isn't theirs, no matter the reason." Sheriff Dawson stepped forward, uncoiling a leather whip. 10 lashes ought to teach the boy a lesson." Emma began to cry, burying her face against Mateo's leg. Elijah stared up at the sheriff, his blue eyes wide with incomprehension. "These children need a guardian," someone called from the crowd, "someone to set them straight." "The orphanage in Tucson, perhaps," suggested Henderson, "after the boy's punishment." Mateo's legs threatened to give way. The orphanage would separate them. He'd heard the stories, boys sent to work farms, girls to domestic service. The twins would never see each other again. They'd never see him again. "No," he whispered, tightening his grip on the twins. "Please, no." Sheriff Dawson unfurled the whip with practiced ease, the leather tail snaking across the wooden platform. Mateo pulled the twins closer, turning his body to shield them from what was to come. "Remove the children," Mayor Franklin commanded, his jowls quivering with authority. 2 women stepped forward reluctantly. One reached for Emma, who screamed and wrapped her arms tighter around Mateo's leg. The other woman approached Elijah, who began to wail. "No!" Mateo shouted, his voice cracking. "Don't touch them!" "Hold the boy," Sheriff Dawson ordered. Two men seized Mateo's arms, wrenching him away from the twins. Emma's fingers left scratch marks on his legs as she was pulled away. Her screams pierced the morning air. 10 lashes, Mayor Franklin repeated, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "And then we'll decide what to do with all 3 of them." Mateo struggled against the men holding him, his eyes never leaving the twins. Emma fought like a wildcat in the woman's arms. Elijah had gone limp with terror, thumb in mouth, tears streaming silently down his face. "Proceed, Sheriff," Henderson called, arms crossed over his chest. Several of the assembled townspeople looked uncomfortable now, shifting their weight from foot to foot, gazes dropping to the ground. Others watched with grim anticipation. Sheriff Dawson raised the whip. Mateo closed his eyes, bracing for the blow. "Stop." The single word, spoken quietly but with unmistakable authority, cut through the crowd noise like a knife. The whip froze mid-air. Heads turned toward the source of the command. A tall figure moved through the parting crowd. He wore buckskin leggings and a cotton shirt open at the throat, revealing a silver medallion on a leather cord. His black hair was pulled back in a neat braid that hung down his back. At his waist, a knife and a pistol were holstered, though his hands were empty, palms facing outward in a gesture of peace. The whispers began immediately. "Apache. Swift Horse. The trader." Swift Horse stepped onto the wooden platform, his moccasins making no sound on the rough boards. His face remained impassive as he surveyed the scene. The crying children, the bound boy, the raised whip. Only his eyes, dark and piercing, revealed any emotion, flashing briefly with something like anger before returning to their usual inscrutable calm. He turned to the mayor, who had taken an involuntary step back. "What crime?" Swift Horse asked, his English accented but clear. Mayor Franklin cleared his throat nervously. "This boy stole corn from Mr. Henderson's farm." Swift Horse looked at Mateo, taking in his skeletal frame, the protective stance he maintained even with his hands bound. "Those children?" he asked, nodding toward the twins. "His siblings," Sheriff Dawson answered, the whip now lowered to his side. "Parents died of fever last month." Swift Horse nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. Then, without a word, he reached into a pouch at his belt and removed several coins. Silver glinted in the morning light as he placed them in a neat stack before Henderson. "What's this?" Henderson demanded, though he couldn't hide the gleam of interest in his eyes at the sight of the silver. "Payment," Swift Horse replied. "For corn." He gestured to the pile of stolen ears. "And more." He added another coin to the stack, then looked at Mayor Franklin. "Enough?" The mayor blinked rapidly, clearly thrown by this unexpected turn of events. "Mr. Henderson, is the payment satisfactory?" Henderson stepped forward, quickly counting the coins. His eyebrows rose. The amount was far more than a few ears of corn were worth. "This doesn't erase the crime," he began, but his fingers closed around the silver. "The children come with me," Swift Horse stated. It wasn't a question. A murmur ran through the crowd. An Apache taking white children? It was unheard of. "Now see here," the sheriff began, but Swift Horse cut him off with a raised hand. "You would whip a boy for feeding his family? What kind of justice is this?" His words hung in the air, unanswerable. The silence stretched until Mayor Franklin finally spoke. "The payment covers the stolen property," he declared, "but the children are a separate matter." Swift Horse's gaze never wavered as he reached into his pouch again, extracting more silver coins. These he placed in a second stack, separate from the payment for the corn. "For the children," he said simply. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Mateo stared in disbelief. Was this man trying to buy them like cattle? "You can't sell children, Franklin," a woman's voice called from the crowd. Mateo recognized Mrs. Peterson, the midwife who had delivered the twins. "He's not buying them," Sheriff Dawson said quickly, though his hand still rested on his gun belt. "He's offering to..." Take responsibility for them. And how do we know what his intentions are? Henderson demanded, though he made no move to return the silver he'd already pocketed. They're white children. Swift Horse's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. The air around him seemed to crackle with tension. I know hunger, he said, his voice low but carrying across the now silent crowd. I know what it is to watch children starve, to feel their ribs beneath your fingers, to bury those too small to survive. His dark eyes swept the gathered townspeople, many of whom looked away, unable to meet his gaze. You knew these children were alone, starving. It wasn't a question. Yet here they stand. The boy is all bones. The little ones cry from empty stomachs. And you would punish him for taking food that would rot in the fields before Henderson could sell it all. Henderson's face flushed crimson. Now wait just a minute. But Swift Horse continued, each word deliberate. 3 summers ago, when the drought killed the buffalo, my people traded with yours. When the fever came to your town, our medicine woman sent healing herbs. When raiders attacked Jensen's ranch, Apache trackers found the stolen horses. He tapped the silver medallion at his throat. I have lived between 2 worlds for 15 years. I have learned your language, your ways. I have earned the right to speak truth. He turned back to Mayor Franklin. These children need food, shelter, care. He pointed to the second stack of coins. This will provide it. Mayor Franklin wiped sweat from his brow, visibly uncomfortable under the Apache's unwavering stare. The boy is old enough to work, he hedged. And the twins, well, there are families in Tucson who might take them in. Separate them? Swift Horse asked, though he clearly knew the answer. Mateo's heart pounded against his ribs. He looked at Emma and Elijah, still crying in the arms of the town women. The thought of losing them, of them losing each other, was unbearable. Please, he whispered, not sure who he was begging. The mayor, Swift Horse, God himself. As if hearing him, Swift Horse turned. For the first time, he addressed Mateo directly. Boy, your name? Mateo, he answered, surprised at being asked. Mateo Miller. And the little ones? Emma and Elijah. Mateo straightened as much as his bound hands would allow. They're only 3. Swift Horse nodded, then spoke words Mateo didn't expect. I had a son once, and a daughter. Something flickered in his eyes, a shadow of old pain. Fever took them, and their mother. He added 1 more coin to the second stack. I have a home, food, land with clean water. The children will be safe. Mateo swallowed hard. This stranger, this Apache, was offering salvation, but at what cost? Would we stay together? He asked, his voice barely audible. Yes. Swift Horse's answer was immediate, certain. And you wouldn't separate them? Mayor Franklin asked, eyeing the growing pile of silver. You'd keep all 3? All 3, Swift Horse confirmed. I give my word. A long silence followed. Mateo held his breath. The twins had gone quiet, perhaps sensing the importance of this moment. Finally, Mayor Franklin reached a decision. He motioned for Sheriff Dawson to cut Mateo's bonds. The boy's punishment is waived, he announced to the crowd, and custody of all 3 children is transferred to Swift Horse in exchange for... He paused, clearly uncomfortable with stating the transaction so plainly, his generous contribution to the town's welfare fund. The ropes fell away from Mateo's wrists, leaving angry red marks on his skin. He rubbed them absently, his mind still struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The women holding Emma and Elijah released them, and they immediately ran to Mateo, clutching at his legs. Swift Horse watched this reunion without expression, then turned to address Mayor Franklin once more. The children will need their belongings. The mayor shifted uncomfortably. I doubt there's much. I'll take them to get their things. Mrs. Peterson interrupted, stepping forward. She fixed Swift Horse with a hard stare. "And I'll be checking on these children, Mr. Swift Horse, regularly." A flicker of approval crossed the Apache's face. "You are welcome at my home, medicine woman." Mrs. Peterson nodded curtly, then knelt before Mateo. "Is there anything at your parents' place you need to bring, child?" Mateo thought of the small cabin, of his mother's worn Bible and his father's hunting knife, of the ragged stuffed bear the twins shared. "Yes, ma'am, just a few things." Swift Horse gestured to a painted pony tethered nearby. "I will prepare for the journey. Meet me here when you are ready." As Mrs. Peterson led them away, Mateo glanced back. The crowd was dispersing, townsfolk murmuring among themselves. Some looked relieved, others troubled. Henderson was nowhere to be seen, having departed with his payment. Swift Horse stood alone on the platform, watching them go. The walk to their cabin took less than 30 minutes. Emma and Elijah, energized by the excitement and confusion, chattered questions that Mateo couldn't answer. "Where are we going, Teo?" Emma asked, skipping beside him. "With the man with the long hair," he replied, unsure how else to explain. "Is he nice?" Elijah wanted to know, thumb back in his mouth. Mateo hesitated. "I think so." "Why did those men tie you up?" Emma persisted. Mrs. Peterson answered before Mateo could. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, Emma, but everything's going to be all right now." Mateo wasn't so sure. Swift Horse had saved them from immediate danger, but what waited for them in his home? Stories of Apache raids had terrified him as a younger child. His father had spoken of them with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. "They're fierce warriors," he'd said once, "but they love their children same as we do." Would Swift Horse love them, or merely tolerate them? And why had he really intervened? At the cabin, Mateo gathered their meager possessions: Mother's Bible, its leather cover cracked with age, Father's hunting knife and the small wooden horse he'd carved for Mateo's 10th birthday, the twins' stuffed bear, missing an eye and leaking sawdust, a few clothes, worn thin but clean. He wrapped it all in a blanket, creating a small bundle. Mrs. Peterson had brought a basket with bread, cheese, and 2 apples, more food than they'd seen in weeks. The twins fell upon it hungrily. "Slowly," she cautioned, breaking the bread into smaller pieces. "Your stomachs aren't used to much food." She pulled Mateo aside while the twins ate. "That Apache has a good reputation in these parts," she said quietly. "Trades fair, speaks true. But you watch out for your siblings, you hear?" "Yes, ma'am." Mateo glanced at the twins, now happily munching apple slices. "Do you think, will we be safe?" Mrs. Peterson's weathered face softened. "Safer than you were here, starving to death with no one to help you." Her tone hardened. This town should be ashamed, letting John and Mary's children come to such a state. She pressed something into his hand, a small sack that clinked softly. "I've been saving this. It's not much, but if you ever need to get away, it might help." Mateo blinked back tears as he tucked the coins into his pocket. "Thank you." When they returned to town, Swift Horse was waiting with 3 horses, his own painted pony, a sturdy brown mare, and a smaller pinto with a gentle eye. "You ride?" he asked Mateo, gesturing to the brown mare. "A little," Mateo admitted. "My father taught me." Swift Horse nodded. "The little ones will ride with us." He approached Emma and Elijah, who shrank back against Mateo's legs. Slowly, he crouched down to their level, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I am Swift Horse," he said, his voice gentler than Mateo had yet heard it. "You are Emma and Elijah." The twins stared at him with wide eyes. "Your brother will ride that horse," he continued, pointing to the mare. "You, little one," he addressed Emma, "will ride with me, and you," he turned to Elijah, "will ride with your brother." Emma's grip on Mateo's leg tightened. "Want to stay with Teo," she whispered. Swift Horse studied Emma's frightened face, then nodded as if coming to a decision. "Then you will both ride with your brother," he said, adjusting his plan without argument. "The mare is strong enough." Relief washed over Emma's features. Elijah removed his thumb from his mouth long enough to ask, "Can Bear come too?" He held up the ragged stuffed toy, and for the first time, Swift Horse's face softened into something approaching a smile. "Bear is welcome," he confirmed solemnly. Mrs. Peterson helped secure their small bundle to Swift Horse's saddle, then embraced each child in turn. When she reached Mateo, she whispered in his ear, "Be brave, but be smart. The Apache have different ways, but they value courage and honesty." With Swift Horse's help, Mateo mounted the mare, then reached down to lift first Elijah, then Emma, settling them securely in front of him. Emma clutched Bear while Elijah held the saddle horn, his small body tense with excitement and fear. "We'll follow the creek north," Swift Horse explained, swinging effortlessly onto his pony. "My home is half a day's ride, in the foothills." They set off at a gentle pace, Swift Horse leading the way. The town of Whitewater quickly receded behind them. Mateo felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension as the only home he'd ever known disappeared from view. The twins, initially rigid with uncertainty, gradually relaxed against him as the horses found their rhythm. The morning sun climbed higher, beating down on their heads. Swift Horse led them along Whitewater Creek, which was little more than a trickle in most places. The landscape gradually changed, the flat, parched plains giving way to rolling hills dotted with mesquite and juniper. "Water!" Swift Horse announced, pointing ahead to a bend in the creek where a small pool had formed beneath an overhanging rock. "We rest the horses." He dismounted in one fluid motion, then helped Mateo lower the twins to the ground. Emma staggered slightly, her legs unsteady after the ride. Swift Horse caught her arm, steadying her with a gentle hand. "Thank you," she whispered, the first words she'd spoken directly to him. He inclined his head in acknowledgement, then led the horses to drink. Mateo cupped his hands to bring water to the twins, who drank greedily. The water was cool and clear, a stark contrast to the tepid, silty liquid they'd been surviving on at the cabin. Swift Horse returned with a small leather pouch. From it, he produced strips of dried meat and a handful of berries. "Eat," he said, offering the food to Mateo. Slowly. Mateo hesitated only briefly before accepting. He broke the jerky into small pieces for the twins, just as Mrs. Peterson had done with the bread. The meat was tough but flavorful, unlike anything they'd tasted before. "What is it?" Elijah asked between chews. "Deer," Swift Horse replied, "from last autumn's hunt." "It's good," Emma declared, reaching for another piece. They ate in silence for a while, the children gradually relaxing in Swift Horse's presence. He kept his movements deliberate and his voice low, seeming to understand their wariness. When they had finished eating, Swift Horse knelt by the pool, splashing water on his face. He noticed Mateo watching him and gestured for the boy to join him. "The marks on your wrists," he said, nodding toward the rope burns. "Water will help." Mateo dipped his hands into the cool pool, wincing as the water touched his raw skin. "My father," Swift Horse said unexpectedly, "taught me to track deer when I was younger than you, to read the land, to find water even in the driest seasons." He gestured toward the pool. "This place stays wet even in drought. The rock shields it from the sun." Mateo glanced up, surprised by the personal information. "My father taught me to ride," he offered tentatively, "and to whittle wood." Swift Horse nodded. "A good skill. Wood speaks to those who listen." So, the twins had wandered a few feet away, investigating a lizard sunning itself on a rock. Swift Horse watched them, his expression unreadable. "They are very young to have faced such hardship," he said quietly. They don't remember much about before, Matteo replied, his throat tightening. About our parents. I tried to tell them stories so they won't forget. Stories are important, Swift Horse agreed. They keep the dead alive in our hearts. An unexpected question formed in Matteo's mind. Before he could reconsider, he blurted out, "Why did you help us?" Really? Swift Horse's dark eyes studied him for a long moment. "Because I once stood where you stand," he finally said. "Young, frightened, protecting little ones who depended on me." Matteo turned Swift Horse's words over in his mind as they continued their journey. The Apache hadn't elaborated, and Matteo hadn't pressed for more. But the knowledge that this stern, enigmatic man might understand his situation better than anyone in Whitewater ever had shifted something in Matteo's perception. They rode through the heat of midday, Swift Horse occasionally pointing out features of the landscape, a hawk's nest high in a dead cottonwood, tracks of a coyote family in the sandy soil, a cluster of prickly pear cactus heavy with ripe fruit. "We will gather those on our return journey," he told Matteo. "Sweet, once you remove the spines." By late afternoon, the foothills of the mountains rose before them. The vegetation grew thicker, the juniper and mesquite joined by pine and oak. The air felt different here, cooler, with a hint of moisture that had been absent in the valley. Emma and Elijah had fallen asleep against Matteo, lulled by the steady rhythm of the horse. His arms ached from holding them secure, but he didn't complain. "There," Swift Horse said, pointing ahead to where the trees parted. "Home." Matteo strained to see through the dappled shadows. He'd expected a teepee, or perhaps a crude shelter of brush and hides. What he saw instead made him blink in surprise. A small valley opened before them, sheltered on three sides by rising hills. A clear stream, a genuine flowing stream, not the parched trickle that was Whitewater Creek, cut through the center. Beside it stood a house built of squared logs, with a stone chimney and a covered porch wrapping around two sides. A corral held several horses that lifted their heads at the newcomer's approach. Behind the house, rows of corn and beans grew in neat furrows, and fruit trees dotted the gentle slope. "You live here?" Matteo couldn't keep the amazement from his voice. "For 12 years, Swift Horse replied, guiding his pony down the trail to the valley floor. "I built it with my wife, Morning Star. We wanted a place between worlds." The twins stirred as the horses slowed. Emma rubbed her eyes, then gasped at the sight of the stream. "Water, Teo! Look at all the water!" Swift Horse halted before the house and dismounted. As he helped Matteo and the twins down, the front door opened. A woman emerged, not Apache, to Matteo's surprise, but a white woman perhaps a few years younger than Mrs. Peterson. Her auburn hair, streaked with gray, was pulled back in a practical bun, and she wore a simple calico dress with an apron. "You've brought guests, Swift Horse," she said, her eyes taking in the children with obvious curiosity. "Sarah," Swift Horse acknowledged with a slight bow of his head. "These are the Miller children, Matteo, Emma, and Elijah. They will stay with us now." If Sarah was surprised by this announcement, she hid it well. "Then they're welcome." She smiled warmly at the twins, who had shrunk against Matteo's legs. "You poor dears must be exhausted. And hungry, I expect." "Children," Swift Horse said, "this is Sarah Baker. She helps me tend the house and garden." "Are you his wife?" Emma asked bluntly, in the direct way of young children. A shadow crossed Sarah's face. "No, child. My husband died in the war, many years ago. I came west to start fresh and met Swift Horse when my wagon train was attacked by bandits. He saved my life." She exchanged a glance with Swift Horse. "We've been friends ever since." Swift Horse nodded, then turned to unsaddle the horses. "Come inside," Sarah urged, holding out her hand to the twins. "Let's get you cleaned up. I've stew on the fire and cornbread in the oven." The interior of the house was simple but comfortable. A large main room contained a cooking area with an iron stove, a sturdy table with benches, and several chairs arranged before the stone fireplace. Woven rugs in bright patterns covered portions of the plank floor. Doorways led to what Matteo assumed were bedrooms. The rich smell of the stew made Matteo's mouth water. The twins' eyes widened at the sight of the substantial meal Sarah ladled into bowls. "Slowly now," Sarah cautioned as she set the steaming bowls before the children. "Your stomachs need time to remember what real food is." Matteo nodded, helping the twins hold their spoons properly, a skill that had begun to fade during their weeks of near starvation. The stew was rich with tender chunks of venison, carrots, potatoes, and wild onions. The cornbread spread with fresh butter melted on his tongue. It was the first proper meal they'd had since their parents fell ill, and Matteo had to fight back tears at the simple pleasure of it. Swift Horse entered as they ate, having tended to the horses. He washed his hands at a basin near the door, then joined them at the table, accepting the bowl Sarah placed before him with a nod of thanks. "Good?" he asked, watching as Emma carefully scooped up a piece of carrot. "Very good," Matteo answered for all of them. "Thank you, sir." "Swift Horse," the Apache corrected mildly. "No sir needed here." They ate in companionable silence for a time, broken only by the twins' occasional murmurs of appreciation. Matteo noticed how Swift Horse and Sarah moved around each other with the ease of people long accustomed to sharing space, reaching for the salt without asking, refilling water cups before they were empty, exchanging glances that seemed to communicate without words. When they had finished eating, Sarah rose to clear the table. "Bath time for these little ones, I think," she said, smiling at the twins. "And clean clothes. I believe I have some things that might fit." "Bath?" Elijah looked alarmed. "In the stream?" Sarah laughed. "No, dear, in a proper tub with warm water." Swift Horse stood. "Matteo, come. I will show you the land while Sarah tends to the little ones." Matteo hesitated, glancing at the twins. They looked uncertain but not frightened. Sarah had already won them over with food and her gentle manner. "I'll be back soon," he promised them. "Be good for Miss Sarah." Outside, the afternoon was waning, golden light slanting through the trees. Swift Horse led him past the corral, where the horses now grazed peacefully, and toward the stream. "The water runs all year," he explained, "from a spring higher in the mountains. It never fails, even in the worst droughts." They followed the stream to a small pool where it widened. Fish darted in the clear water, actual fish, just as Matteo had described in his stories to the twins. Beyond the pool, the garden stretched in neat rows. "Corn, beans, squash," Swift Horse pointed. "The three sisters, we call them. They grow well together. The beans climb the corn stalks. The squash leaves shade the ground, keeping moisture in." He continued the tour, showing Matteo a smokehouse where venison and fish were preserved, a root cellar dug into the hillside, and a small stable attached to the main corral. "You have built a good life here," Matteo observed, impressed by the self-sufficiency of the homestead. "It was not always so." Swift Horse leaned against the corral fence. "When I was younger than you, my village was attacked by soldiers. Many died. The rest were forced to move to the reservation." Matteo remained silent, sensing Swift Horse had more to say. "I was angry, filled with hate. I joined war parties, attacked settlers." His voice was matter-of-fact, not boastful or apologetic. "Then I met a man, a doctor from the East. He treated my wounds after a fight, though I was his enemy. He spoke of another way to live." "What happened to him?" Matteo asked when Swift Horse fell silent. "He died of the fever that took many that winter. But before he died, he taught me his language, his medicine. I decided to honor him by finding a different path." Swift Horse turned to face Matteo directly. "I tell you this so you understand. I have walked in darkness and in light. I choose light now, but I remember the darkness. Matteo nodded, understanding the message beneath the words. I know pain. I know anger. I know what it is to lose everything. When my parents died, he said hesitantly, I was so angry. At God, at the townspeople who didn't help us, even at my parents for leaving us. Anger is like fire, Swifthorse replied. It can warm you, drive you forward, or it can consume you, leave nothing but ashes. He placed a hand on Matteo's shoulder. Your anger protected your brother and sister. It kept you fighting when others would have surrendered. But now, perhaps, you can let it cool. They returned to the house as the sun dipped below the western hills. Inside, they found the twins transformed, clean, dressed in what appeared to be new clothes, their hair still damp from bathing. Teo! Emma exclaimed. Miss Sarah has a whole box of toys. And look, she twirled, showing off her calico dress. Pretty clothes. Elijah was carefully stacking wooden blocks on the rug before the fireplace, his face a study in concentration. He looked up at Matteo's entrance, his smile revealing the gap where he'd lost a tooth the previous winter. We're staying here now, he announced, as if he'd made the decision himself. Days melted into weeks as summer reached its peak. The rhythm of life at Swifthorse's homestead gradually became familiar to Matteo and the twins. Each morning, they rose with the sun. Sarah prepared breakfast, cornmeal mush with honey and fresh berries, or eggs from the chickens that scratched in the yard. Swifthorse would be outside already, having tended to the horses and checked his traps. After breakfast, Matteo helped with chores, feeding animals, weeding the garden, fetching water from the stream. Swifthorse began teaching him to ride properly, to identify edible plants, to move quietly through the woods. The twins followed Sarah like ducklings, helping as she cooked and cleaned, listening wide-eyed to the stories she told of her life before coming west. In the afternoons, when the sun was hottest, Sarah conducted school lessons. She'd been a teacher back east before marrying, and she insisted education was essential, even on the frontier. Your mother would want you to learn your letters, she told Matteo, placing a slate and chalk before him, and your sums. Matteo didn't argue, though he'd had little formal schooling even before his parents died. To his surprise, he found he enjoyed learning. Numbers made sense to him, and he devoured the small collection of books Sarah kept on a shelf by the fireplace. Tales of adventure and exploration, a worn Bible, a medical text left by the doctor who had changed Swifthorse's life. The twins thrived under the steady care. Their hollow cheeks filled out, their steps grew more certain, their laughter more frequent. Emma especially blossomed, revealing a natural gift for language as she absorbed words from both English and Apache with equal ease. Elijah remained quieter, but showed a talent for working with his hands, carefully watching Swifthorse whittle wood or repair a bridle, then attempting the skills himself. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies rise from the meadow, Matteo found the courage to ask Swifthorse a question that had been troubling him. Will we go to school? In town, I mean. Swifthorse considered the question, his face unreadable in the gathering dusk. There is a school in Blue Mesa, half a day's ride from here, he said finally. Some settlers' children attend, some Apache and Navajo children too. Could we go? You wish to? Matteo nodded slowly. I think our parents would want it, and I want the twins to have opportunities. Swifthorse was silent for a long moment. Education is a weapon and a shield, he said finally. It can protect you in ways a knife or gun cannot. He nodded, decision made. When autumn comes, we will speak to the teacher. 2 days later, a visitor arrived. Mrs. Peterson, true to her word about checking on the children. She came in a small wagon driven by her grandson, bringing gifts. A quilt she'd sewn for the twins, a book of poetry for Matteo, jars of preserved peaches. Swifthorse welcomed her with formal courtesy. showing her around the homestead while the children trailed behind. If Mrs. Peterson was surprised by the comfortable arrangements or the obvious care being given to the children, she didn't say so directly. But Mateo noticed how her initial tension eased as the visit progressed. Before leaving, she took Mateo aside. "You're looking well, child, all of you. Are you truly happy here?" Mateo considered the question seriously. "Yes," he said after a moment. "Swift Horse is teaching me many things. The twins are growing strong again. Sarah is kind." Mrs. Peterson studied his face, seeming to search for any hint of coercion or fear. Finding none, she nodded. "Very well. I'll tell folks in town that the Miller children are thriving." "Thank you for checking on us," Mateo said. Then, after a hesitation, "And thank you for the money. I've kept it safe, but I don't think we'll need to run away." Her weathered face softened. "Keep it anyway, for your future." After Mrs. Peterson departed, Mateo found Swift Horse by the stream, repairing a fishing net. The Apache worked methodically, his fingers deftly threading the twine. "She was worried about us," Mateo said, sitting cross-legged on the bank beside him. Swift Horse nodded. "As she should be. It is good that some in your town cared enough to worry." "She seemed surprised that we're doing so well here. Many white people believe my kind cannot provide for children." Swift Horse's tone held no bitterness, just a statement of fact. "They do not see that caring for the young is sacred to us." "Why did you really take us in?" Mateo asked suddenly. "The truth!" Swift Horse's hands stilled on the net. "I told you the truth in town. I had a son, a daughter. They died, along with my wife." Swift Horse set aside the fishing net and looked out over the stream. The water caught the late afternoon light, transforming into liquid gold where it rippled over stones. "But there is more," he admitted quietly. "Something I did not say in town." Mateo waited, sensing the weight of the words to come. "When I saw you standing there, bound and frightened, with the little ones clinging to your legs, I saw myself." Swift Horse's voice grew soft with memory. "Many years ago, soldiers attacked my village while the men were hunting. I was 13, not yet a warrior, but no longer a child. My mother was killed. My younger brother and sister survived." He picked up a small stone and rolled it between his fingers. "I tried to care for them, to feed them, to keep them safe. But the journey to the reservation was hard. Winter came early that year. My brother grew sick. Then, my sister." Swift Horse fell silent. Mateo could see the pain etched into the lines of his face, still fresh despite the passage of time. "I failed them," he said finally. "They died in my arms, one after the other. I could do nothing but watch their spirits leave." He turned to meet Mateo's gaze directly. "When I saw you in town, I saw a boy determined not to fail, a boy who would steal rather than watch his family starve, who would face the whip to feed his brother and sister." He placed a hand on Mateo's shoulder. "I saw courage worthy of respect." Tears welled in Mateo's eyes. "But I did fail them. They were starving. If you hadn't come..." "But I did come," Swift Horse interrupted gently, "just as someone should have come for me and my siblings." "The circle turns, Mateo. What was broken begins to heal." They sat in silence as the sun dipped lower. From the house, they could hear the twins laughing as Sarah told them a story. "You asked if I took you in out of pity or duty," Swift Horse said finally. "Neither is true. I took you in because your spirit called to mine across the years, because in saving you, perhaps I save a piece of myself." He smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his stern features. "And because those little ones deserve to grow up laughing." That night, after the twins were asleep in the small bedroom they shared, Mateo sat before the fire with his mother's Bible open on his lap. He traced the familiar names written inside the cover. His parents, grandparents, his own name and the twins, recorded in his father's careful hand. Swift Horse entered quietly, carrying a small wooden box. He sat opposite Matteo and placed the box between them. "For you," he said. Matteo opened it to find a knife, not a hunting knife like his father's, but something finer. The handle was carved from antler, inlaid with turquoise stones. The blade, when he carefully drew it from its sheath, gleamed in the firelight. "I made it," Swift Horse explained. "From the antlers of the first deer I hunted after building this home. The blade comes from the east, good steel that holds an edge." Matteo stared at the gift, overwhelmed by its significance. Among the Apache, he knew, receiving a knife meant more than just acquiring a tool. It was an acknowledgement of approaching manhood, of trust, of belonging. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "Then say nothing," Swift Horse replied. "Words are wind, actions endure." As autumn painted the hills in fiery colors, the children began attending the school in Blue Mesa. Matteo rode the brown mare, with Emma seated before him and Elijah behind, following the trail Swift Horse had shown them. The teacher, Miss Abernathy, welcomed them warmly, assigning seats and books with brisk efficiency. "Your guardian speaks highly of your intelligence," she told Matteo. "I expect great things from all of you." In the evenings, they returned to the valley, to Swift Horse and Sarah, to the house that had become home, to the place where a starving boy had found not just food for his body, but nourishment for his soul. And if sometimes Matteo woke in the night, heart racing with memories of hunger and fear, he would hear Swift Horse moving quietly through the house, checking on each sleeping child, a guardian whose vigilance never wavered, whose protection was as constant as the stream that flowed through their valley, bringing life even in the driest seasons.